A patient presents with acute panic awakenings, severe aversive reactions to touch, and an aggressive refusal to provide standard medical records. In cases of long-running intrafamilial harm, forensic specialists rarely uncover a confession or direct physical evidence. Silence in these environments acts as an active, structural feature of the family system. It is maintained by a highly predictable, interlocking set of mechanisms, including financial dependency, cultural shame, and designated relatives who serve as gatekeepers. To uncover these deep hidden systems, we apply a reverse reconstruction model based on recent clinical source material. This is a flowchart mapping the reconstruction model. We start with the downstream observable behavioral signals on the right and work backward to identify the minimum upstream conditions required to generate them. With direct evidence suppressed for decades, reverse engineering the family structure is the only method to identify a concealed trauma system. We trace this system from descendants in the 2020s, Generation 4, back to the historical origin of Generation 1 in the 1930s. Epigenetic and neurobiological factors influence how trauma is processed, but they operate alongside intense environmental conditioning. The primary engine of trauma concealment and transmission across decades is an enforced social architecture, rather than direct biological inheritance. This model identifies high-risk systemic conditions. It does not provide deterministic proof of specific sexual or physical acts. We evaluate probabilistic risk, the compounding variables that make an outcome highly likely, instead of relying on deterministic assumptions that certain events are guaranteed to happen. The objective is to prove how a highly probable architecture of silence survives across multiple generations, insulating the originators from detection. Isolating the Generation 3 layer, we see a trauma-consistent symptom cluster in adult caregivers, mapping behaviors like panic awakenings, hypercontrol, and disproportionate punishment. These behaviors point to an enduring alteration in limbic threat processing, the brain network responsible for detecting danger and regulating emotional responses. This alteration points to a chronic adaptation to a generally dangerous developmental environment, independent of one specific abuse type. The strongest behavioral indicator of a concealed system emerges during incidents of collective, synchronized fear among multiple family members. A synchronized fear response among adults, followed immediately by a coordinated silence, indicates the presence of a pre-existing shared implicit threat model. The family enforces this threat model through modern concealment behaviors, explicitly framing major medical events as private and actively refusing to provide verifiable records to outside institutions. Hyperarousal symptoms become highly probative of concealed intrafamilial abuse only when they co-occur with the family's active, coordinated control over external information. Moving one generation backward to Generation 2, we must establish how a family successfully conceals ongoing harm for over half a century. This diagram illustrates the required characteristics of a closed family system: centralized authority, poorly permeable boundaries to outsiders, and strict narrative control. This structure relies on triangulation, where a third person acts as a buffer between an authority and an internal challenger. Maintaining this requires distributed role specialization among siblings to protect the core. They intercept external inquiries and label internal dissenters as unstable. These internal systems seamlessly co-opt broader cultural dynamics, such as honor and shame concerns in conservative environments, to morally justify their silence. Generation 2 actively reproduces a learned permission structure where protecting the authority figure outweighs accountability at every level. If Generation 2 operates this toxic system, an analytical error often occurs, assuming all abused descendants are inevitably destined to perpetrate harm themselves. The victim-to-perpetrator pipeline is highly contingent. Most abused individuals do not become offenders. This matrix maps the heterogeneity and protective factors among siblings raised in the same dangerous lineage. Offending risk compounds through antisocial tendencies, coercive scripts, and a lack of accountability. Other siblings are insulated by secure attachments to outside adults, external mentoring, and different marriage patterns. Meta-analytic evidence confirms a moderate association between victimization and offending, but large prospective cohort studies show that abused individuals are not uniquely destined to offend compared to controls. Abusive behavior is a probabilistic outcome of opportunity and system failure. Stepping back to the leftmost node of the model, we locate the extreme macro conditions that generate this level of family authoritarianism. The historical origin condition for this specific lineage traces to the massive internment and forced displacement campaigns in Cyrenaica, eastern Libya, in the early 1930s. Roughly 100,000 civilians were interned in these camps, resulting in substantial mortality and the complete shattering of regional social structures. The psychological ecology of these camps centered on absolute power imbalances, prolonged deprivation, and public humiliation. These elements systematically break down ordinary protective norms, creating textbook upstream conditions for complex trauma. Complex trauma is a psychological condition resulting from prolonged, repeated exposure to severe interpersonal stress, where escape is impossible. If a traumatized survivor becomes a family patriarch without reparative processing, the coercion of the internment camp translates directly into household control. While this historical event does not prove a specific abuse occurred decades later, it provides a perfectly calibrated origin condition for a multi-generational architecture of silence. Now that the reverse engineering is complete, we run the established model forward chronologically to observe the full system in motion. This flowchart tracks the initial sequence. Historical macrotrauma produces severe survivor dysregulation, shaping harsh, fear-based parenting. Over time, this crystallizes into a rigid family architecture of secrecy and authority protection. This guarantees disclosure failure, shielding subsequent harm and generating the hyper-aroused clinical symptoms seen in descendants. The system operates with peak efficiency because community norms regarding taboo and family reputation actively deter victims from reporting. This cycle is sustained by a perfectly designed, highly efficient social loop. Treating this phenomenon strictly as a biological or epigenetic condition ignores the structural reality of how families hide abuse. At the clinical level, care must prioritize somatic regulation. Somatic regulation refers to therapies that focus on the physical body to calm the nervous system's response to trauma. Clinicians must actively help descendants separate protective caution from coercive control. To dismantle this system, institutions must break the social ecological permission structure from the outside. We apply frameworks like the World Health Organization's INSPIRE package. INSPIRE is an evidence-based set of 7 strategies designed to end violence against children through legal, normative, and educational interventions. We must build safe, confidential reporting pathways that entirely bypass the family's designated gatekeepers. Abuse thrives on enmeshment and blind loyalty. By reverse engineering the architecture of silence, forensic and clinical specialists extract the blueprint required to collapse the system.